cannabis research has shown some promise. There's been some interesting things looked at, like the drug abuse liability when you co-administer an opioid with something like THC or CBD. Now, the research is a little mixed on this. It shows that, well, it doesn't increase the liability or the drug abuse liability of using cannabis or of cannabis products, but there are some inconsistencies with whether or not it reduces opioid drug use every time. There are nuances to this discussion about when cannabis is effective, whether it's a state program reducing opioid prescriptions and overdoses. There are, issues with people being able to access it. For example, early adopters who had both adult use and medical cannabis programs saw perhaps the biggest benefits versus other states. So just because you have a law or one dispensary open in your state doesn't mean you're going to suddenly magically see these benefits. And also, there are changes that can happen to these programs which can affect their functionality. So there are confounding variables. Other drugs people are using, prescription and illicit. Some of these studies do not take into account product composition. So is it THC rich? Is it CBD rich? How potent is it? How much are they using? And there's also potential drug-drug interactions that could be explaining some of these effects. So when we talk about just at a basic level, what mechanisms happen, when you're zooming in through the microscope onto cells? Well, animals which don't have cannabinoid receptors have reduced opiate rewards. That is, they have trouble basically becoming addicted or displaying that behavior in a laboratory setting. Opioids regulate the release of endocannabinoids, their synthesis, and endocannabinoids alter opioid peptide levels. So they kind of help to stimulate each other. The endocannabinoid system and the endorphin system often work in concert or together. Their receptors are expressed in the same cells in very particular neuronal pathways, many of which are implicated in use disorders and addiction. Opioid and cannabinoid receptors also share similar intrasignaling cascades. And so the key point here is that there is a convergence of opioid-cannabinoid interactions, which opens up opportunities to assess potential cannabinoid interventions for OUD, for opioid use disorder. So let's make a case for CBD for opioid use disorder, and we'll start with just some simple fun things about receptors and cells. What's really interesting is that we talk about CBD being an allosteric modulator, modulating CB1 receptor. It also has this effect at the mu and sigma opioid receptors, which is helped make things that it changed the interaction or the effect or the kinetics or something is happening there when CBD is in the system and there are opioids present at the receptors. In animals, CBD as early as 1975 was shown to reduce the rewarding properties and withdrawal effects of opioids in mice. More recently, it's been shown to attenuate cue-induced heroin-seeking behavior. You get an animal dependent on heroin. They will push a bell, ring a buzzer, go in part of the cage to demand or request heroin. And you can trigger this by conditioning them to kind of like Pavlov's dog. Every time they hear a bell or see a light, it means an injection. And this is actually related to something called CFOS-positive neurons. And across mammals, kind of the more higher levels you have of CFOS that are correlated or associated with a high potential for substance use. In animals that are abusing inhalants or other drugs, you see this increase in CFOS. It's thought that if you can decrease the number of CFOS-positive neurons in places like the amygdala, which help control things like anxiety and fear, that you will help diminish the rewarding properties of other drugs of abuse. In humans, CBD is shown to modulate anxiety, which anxiety is very triggering for addiction and relapse. CBD can help reduce amygdala activation, so that fear and anxiety response. And in a pilot study by Dr. Yasmin Hurd, they found that CBD reduced similar heroin-related cue-induced cravings. So in a very particular part of the addiction and relapse cycle, CBD was shown to be effective, similar to what we've seen in animals. So basically what we're saying here is these properties that reducing the rewarding effects of drugs of abuse, reducing anxiety, these could translate into potentially modulating the addiction-related outcomes. These are good things to think about if you're trying to treat a substance use disorder. Really, really interesting study on fentanyl and CBD administered in humans. So this is really kind of the proof, the first sort of safety test that, well, if cannabinoids, things from the cannabis plant, preparations of cannabis products, are useful for treating opioid use disorder or could potentially be a replacement, how do they interact with one of the most potent and dangerous opioids we know? So if we hypothesize that CBD is a potential treatment for opioid addiction, then a safety study is an important first step. So let's, this is the researchers thinking, let's give CBD to people who are taking a high potency opioid. And what they found was really important is CBD does not exacerbate adverse events associated with intravenous fentanyl administration, that is, injections of fentanyl. So when you administer CBD with fentanyl in a clinical setting, it was safe and well tolerated. And again, this provides data for this foundational work for moving this research ahead. We're really kind of at the tip of the iceberg here in moving this research along and getting really targeted in what products work, which ones don't, when to use them, when not to use them, what administration form.